The morning of October the 12th, 1888, the air over the Providence Valley held the sharp, clean bite of coming snow. On the steps of the courthouse, Temperance Shaw felt the cold through the soles of her worn shoes, a chill that had little to do with the weather. She held a single silver dollar in her palm, its surface worn smooth by 1,000 other hands. Beside her, her sister Verity stood so still she might have been carved from the same granite as the courthouse steps. They were 18 years old that autumn, the day the orphanage gates had closed behind them for good, and the world had shown them its true and unsparing face. Inside, Judge Cromwell was laughing, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He was a man whose piety was a cloak for his cruelty, and the town followed his lead. The offer was a joke, a piece of public theatre meant to humiliate the two orphans who had nowhere to go. The old Blackwood Mill, a collapsed and rotten skeleton of a building 2 miles up Swift Creek, its water rights and a quarter-acre of stony ground, all for $1. $1 to take a ruin off the county's hands, $1 for the privilege of starving in a place even squatters avoided. What nobody knew, what the laughing men in the courthouse could never comprehend, was that the sisters' father had been a stonemason. He had not left them money, but he had left them the memory of his hands, the feel of a plumb line, and a small brass spirit level whose bubble told the truest story in the world. People are not always what they seem. Temperance stepped forward, her shadow long in the morning sun. She placed the dollar on the clerk's dusty counter. The coin made a small, lonely sound in the quiet that followed the judge's laughter. There was the scratching of a pen, the heavy thud of a wax seal, and a deed was pushed into her hand. It was done. They owned a ghost. They turned and walked away from the town of Providence without looking back, the sound of muffled chuckles following them like a stray dog. They carried one bundle between them, containing a loaf of bread, a small tin of lard, a blanket, and their father's spirit level wrapped in oilcloth. The walk was long, the road dwindling to a deer trail that followed the restless water of the creek. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. They did not speak. There were no words for this kind of beginning, this kind of ending. Verity's hand found Temperance's, her grip firm and cool. It was the only reassurance they had. Therefore, they kept walking, putting the town and its small cruelties behind them with every step, moving toward a ruin they had never seen but had just purchased with the last of their worldly wealth. They were walking toward the place that was supposed to break them. The place they would have to call home. The first sight of the mill was a blow. It was worse than the rumors, worse than they could have imagined. The great stone walls stood, but they were jagged and broken, like old teeth. The roof was a hollow more open to the sky, its heavy timbers splintered and strewn across the floor inside, tangled with weeds and the debris of a generation of floods. The great water wheel, the heart of the place, was a wreck. Half its paddles were gone, and the axle on which it sat had dropped, tilted at a drunken angle, its iron hub seized with rust. The flume that should have guided the creek's water was a collapsed trench of rotted wood and scattered rock. The creek itself ran wild past the foundation, eating at the mortar, patient and relentless. Verity let out a breath, a small, shaky sound she immediately tried to stifle. But Temperance heard it. She squeezed her sister's hand, her gaze moving over the destruction not with despair, but with a strange and unnerving calm. She was seeing not what was, but what had been, and what could be again. She saw the lines of the foundation, the cut of the stones, the logic of the structure. Her father had taught her to see the bones of a thing. "The water is strong here," Temperance said, her voice quiet. It was the first thing either of them had spoken since leaving town. Verity looked from the ruin to the churning creek, then back again. "It is strong enough to have done all this." Temperance shook her head. "No. It was neglect that did this. The water is just water. It only does what it is told." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the sound of the creek filling the air. This was their inheritance. A pile of broken stone and the ceaseless motion of water. It was a testament to failure. But as the sun began to dip behind the high canyon walls, casting long, cold shadows, Temperance unwrapped the spirit level from its oilcloth. She walked to the nearest standing wall and placed the brass tool against the stone. The bubble inside the vial drifted, then settled. It was almost perfectly centered. The foundation was true. That first week was a battle for inches. They found a small, dry corner in what had once been the miller's office, a room where a section of the roof still held, miraculously. They cleared the debris, using their bare hands and broken planks as levers. They swept the stone floor clean with a broom made from a pine bough and patched the worst of the holes in the wall with a paste of mud and dried grass. This small space, no bigger than a pantry, became their fortress against the encroaching night and the deepening cold. They slept huddled together under the single blanket, the sound of the creak a constant murmur outside their patched wall. During the day, they worked. They began with the ruin itself, a task so monumental it seemed impossible. But they did not look at the hole. They looked at the next stone. The next splintered board. Temperance directed the labor with a quiet authority, her eyes constantly scanning, calculating. Verity, ever practical, managed their dwindling food supply and scouted the woods for anything edible, late-season berries, tough roots, a handful of pine nuts. They learned the rhythms of the place, the way the sun struck the canyon at midday, the direction of the prevailing wind. They were utterly alone, but they were not lonely. Their shared purpose was a third presence, a silent companion in their labor. One afternoon, while clearing the main floor, Temperance's shovel struck something solid. It was one of the great millstones, half buried in silt and debris. It was immense, carved from a single piece of granite, its grinding face etched with a pattern of radiating lines, smooth and precise. She ran her hand over its cold surface, feeling the ghost of the craftsman who had shaped it. This was the purpose of the whole structure, this turning of stone against stone to make bread. It was a kind of magic. She called Verity over. Together, they worked for 2 days to clear the stone, to lever it up, to see it whole. When it was finally free, Temperate placed the spirit level on its surface. The bubble was perfect. The stone was balanced. It was a small victory, but it was enough. It was a promise that order could be coaxed from chaos. That night, a thin, early snow began to fall, dusting the valley in white. Huddled in their small room, watching the flakes drift past the open doorway, Verity shivered. "We have no more bread." Temperance did not look away from the fire. "Then we will learn to fish." It was not a boast, nor a prayer. It was a statement of fact. Survival was a series of problems to be solved, one after another. And they would solve them. The work was brutal. Their hands, soft from the darning and laundry of the orphanage, became calloused, then cracked and bleeding. Every muscle ached with a fire that never quite went out. Their first major project was to secure the roof over their small living space and then extend it over the main gearing pit. They could not rebuild the entire massive roof, not yet. But they could create a workshop, a place protected from the snow that was now falling with more frequency. They scavenged the fallen timbers, prizing out the bent iron nails, painstakingly straightening them one by one on a flat stone. Temperance inspected every piece of wood, judging its integrity by its weight and the sound it made when struck. She showed Verity how to spot the rot, the subtle sponginess that meant the wood had lost its strength. Together, they learned to use a rusty saw they found in the debris, its teeth dull and uneven. It took them an hour to cut through a single beam. But they worked from dawn until their fingers were too numb to feel, their progress measured in feet, not yards. They built a crude ladder and climbed onto the broken walls, clearing away the debris, creating a stable surface for the new rafters. It was dangerous work. A slip, a loose stone, would mean a fall they would not survive. But fear was a luxury they could not afford. They moved with a deliberate slowness, testing every foothold, every handhold, their movements economical and precise. One afternoon, as Temperance was setting a main rafter, the timber shifted unexpectedly. She lost her balance, her feet skidding on the damp stone. Below her was a 20-foot drop onto a floor of broken rock. In that split second, Verity, who had been holding the other end of the beam, did not scream. She did not hesitate. She threw her entire weight onto her end of the rafter, digging her worn shoes into the stone, her knuckles white. The beam settled. The crisis passed. Temperance found her footing, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at her sister, whose face was pale but resolute. "Thank you," Temperance whispered. Verity just nodded, her jaw tight. Hold it steady this time. Their trust in each other was absolute, forged not in words but in shared labor and shared risk. They were two halves of a single machine, each anticipating the other's needs, each compensating for the other's weakness. The work continued, day after day, until a solid, ugly, but waterproof section of roof covered the heart of the mill. It was their first great act of creation, a defiant gesture against the wilderness and the memory of the laughing men in town. They had made shelter. With a section of the mill secured, their focus shifted to the mechanism itself. The heart of the problem was the main driveshaft and the gearing that transferred power from the water wheel to the millstones. The wooden teeth on the great pit wheel were shattered, and the smaller iron lantern gear it was meant to turn was a cracked husk of rust. Worse, the main shaft itself, a timber as thick as a man's body, had a deep, splintering crack running half its length. They could replace the wooden teeth, given time and patience. They could carve new ones from seasoned hardwood found in the forest. But the iron gear was beyond them. The cracked shaft was a death sentence for the entire project. There was no way to repair it, no way to replace it. Temperance spent days studying it, running her hands over the cracked metal, the splintered wood, her brow furrowed in concentration. She made sketches in the dirt with a stick, trying to imagine a way around the problem. But there was none. They needed a blacksmith. And they had no money to pay one. Verity, ever the pragmatist, knew what they had to do. She had heard whispers in town, before they left, of a man named Abram who kept a smithy upriver, a recluse who traded work for goods and rarely came down into the valley. He was their only hope. Leaving Temperance to continue the slow work of clearing the channel for the flume, Verity set off one morning with a small sack containing their only two assets of value, a handful of straightened nails and the rusty, broken head of a sledgehammer they had found. It was a fool's errand, trading junk for a miracle, but it was the only plan they had. The walk took her half a day, following the creek deeper into the mountains. She found the smithy by the plume of dark smoke rising against the grey sky. It was a squat, powerful building of stone and heavy timber, the air around it ringing with the rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel. Inside, a man who seemed to be made of the same material as his forge was working, his back to the door. He was broad and grey-bearded, his arms corded with muscle. He did not turn when Verity entered. "I am not buying," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And I am not hiring." Verity stood her ground, her heart pounding. "I am not selling. And I am not looking for a job." The hammering stopped. He turned slowly, his eyes, nested in a web of wrinkles, were the color of faded slate. He looked at the small girl, at her patched dress and determined face, and then at the meager sack in her hand. He grunted, a sound of dismissal. "Then what do you want?" Verity opened the sack and placed the broken hammerhead and the handful of nails on a workbench. "We need an iron gear cast. And we need bands for a cracked shaft." Abram looked at the pitiful offering and let out a short, harsh laugh. "Is this a joke?" Verity met his gaze without flinching. "No. It is a trade." He was about to order her out, but something in her stillness, in the quiet dignity that refused to be dismissed, gave him pause. He picked up the broken hammerhead. It was old, of good steel, but hopelessly fractured. "This is worthless," he said, but his tone was less certain now. "My sister can fix anything made of wood or stone," Verity said, her voice steady. "But not iron. That requires a different kind of fire." The old blacksmith looked from the girl to the open door of his forge, where the coals glowed with a fierce, contained heat. He saw not a beggar, but an emissary from a world of work he understood. He set the hammerhead down. "Your sister," he said. "Bring her to me." Temperance arrived at Abram's forge the next day, carrying not goods, but a small, carefully drawn diagram on a piece of smooth birch bark. It showed the gear assembly, with precise measurements and notes on the ratio of teeth required to turn the millstones at the correct speed. Abram took the drawing without a word, his slate-grey eyes scanning the details. He had expected a desperate plea, not a technical schematic. He looked up at Temperance, at her calloused hands and the smudge of dirt on her cheek. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a focused intelligence. He grunted. You know what this means? This ratio? It means the runner stone will turn 13 times for every one turn of the great wheel, Temperance answered immediately. Fast enough to grind fine, but not so fast it burns the flour. Abram tested her further, pointing to a detail on the drawing. And this offset? Why not a direct drive? To allow for a belt to run a hoist for the grain sacks, she said. And a bran sifter, eventually. The power has to be useful for more than just the stones. He was silent for a long time, studying the drawing, then studying the young woman before him. He had lived a lifetime around men who built things, and he knew the language of competence when he heard it. He saw it in the sureness of her hands, in the clarity of her thinking. He saw the ghost of his own daughter, who had loved the logic of machines. He walked over to a pile of scrap metal, the discards of a dozen other jobs. He pulled out a heavy, rusted gear from a broken piece of farm equipment. It was not the right size, but it was solid iron. He tossed it onto the dirt floor, where it landed with a heavy thud. The price, he said, his voice rough, is that you will work for it. You will be my striker. You will learn the fire. Temperance looked at the heavy sledgehammers leaning against the forge, then at her own slender arms. She then looked at the scrap gear, a piece of raw material waiting to be reborn. When do we start? She asked. And so began a new phase of their education. While Verity managed the mill, shoring up walls and continuing the slow work of clearing the flume, Temperance spent her days in the heat and fury of the smithy. She learned the different colors of heated iron, from dull red to bright, almost liquid white. She learned the rhythm of the sledgehammer, the way to strike a clean, flat blow that shaped the metal without weakening it. Abram was a harsh teacher. He never offered praise, only gruff corrections. Too slow, too soft, watch the grain, but beneath the gruffness was a current of respect. He was not giving her a gift, he was engaging in a fair exchange. Labor for labor. Knowledge for knowledge. They were building more than a gear. They were forging an alliance. The autumn deepened, the days growing shorter, the nights colder. A quiet urgency settled over their work. The new gear took shape slowly, forged from the salvaged iron, shaped by fire and hammer and Temperance's aching muscles. Back at the mill, Verity had made her own progress. She had, through painstaking effort, rebuilt a section of the flume, the wooden channel that would guide the water to the wheel. She had learned to dress the stones, to fit them together so tightly that no mortar was needed, a skill she absorbed by studying the original builder's work. She had a feel for it, an intuitive understanding of weight and balance. She and Temperance worked in tandem, even when they were miles apart. Temperance would return from the smithy at dusk, exhausted and covered in soot, and describe the iron bands Abram was forging for the main shaft. Verity would then show Temperance the progress on the flume, and they would plan the next day's labor by the light of their small fire. They were two pillars supporting a single roof. One afternoon, as they were fitting the newly forged iron bands around the cracked driveshaft, they received a visitor. It was Judge Cromwell, mounted on a fine horse that picked its way delicately through the debris. He did not dismount. He looked down at the two young women, at their dirt-streaked faces and patched clothes, and a slow, superior smile spread across his face. He surveyed the work they had done, the patched roof, the cleared floor, the slowly healing flume. It was more than he had expected, but it was still a ruin. An impressive effort, he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. A testament to youthful energy. But winter is coming. The deed stipulates that the mill must be operational by the 1st of the year. A safety clause, you understand. To prevent vagrancy, Temperance and Verity exchanged a look. There had been no mention of such a clause. We were not told of any deadline, Verity said, her voice quiet but firm. The judge shrugged, a theatrical gesture of helplessness. It is there, in the fine print. The law is the law. I am afraid if the wheel is not turning by then, the property reverts to the county. For your own good, of course. He did not wait for a reply. He turned his horse and rode away, leaving the sisters in a stunned silence. The 1st of the year. It was less than 2 months away. The task, which had seemed merely monumental, was now impossible. The first snows of winter were already on the high peaks. The creek would soon freeze. They had been tricked. The dollar they had paid was not for a chance, but for a sentence. They were to fail, and the town would have another laugh at their expense. That night, for the first time, Temperance felt the cold weight of despair. She looked at the massive, silent water wheel, at the gears that were not yet connected, at the stones that had not yet turned. The judge's words echoed in the darkness. The law is the law. It was a weapon he wielded with precision, a tool to maintain an order that benefited men like him. But as she stared into the darkness, she felt Verity's hand on her shoulder. He thinks the law is a set of words on paper, Verity said softly. Our father taught us that the truest laws are in stone and water and iron. We will obey those laws. The deadline changed everything. The patient, methodical pace of their work was shattered, replaced by a frantic, desperate race against the coming winter. Sleep became a brief, dreamless stupor snatched between hours of relentless labor. They worked by moonlight when they had to, their hands raw, their bodies screaming with exhaustion. Abram, hearing of the judge's visit, began working at his forge with a renewed fury, his hammer blows ringing late into the night. He knew Cromwell's ways. He knew this was not about safety, it was about greed. The judge wanted the land back, cleared by the sisters' free labor. The final pieces of the puzzle were the paddles for the great water wheel. Temperance and Verity felled a dead, seasoned pine, and with their dull saw and a set of chisels Abram had given them, they began to shape the new paddles. It was exacting work. Each one had to be identical in weight and shape to maintain the wheel's balance. They worked side by side, their movements a synchronized dance of muscle and will. As the last paddle was being fitted, the weather turned. A storm, born in the high peaks, descended on the valley. It began with a cold, driving rain that quickly turned to sleet, then heavy, wet snow. The creek, fed by the sudden melt and the relentless precipitation, began to rise. It turned from a clear, swift stream into a brown, roaring monster, tearing at its banks, carrying logs and debris before it. The water level in the flume rose dangerously high, threatening to overwhelm the new stonework, to wash away months of labor in a single night. The storm was their supreme ordeal. It was the valley itself testing their creation. They had to save the flume. They tied ropes around their waists, anchoring themselves to the mill's foundation, and waded into the churning, freezing water. The current was a physical blow, trying to tear them from their feet. Using long poles, they fought to clear the debris that was piling up against the headgate, a growing dam that threatened to burst and destroy everything. The water was so cold it burned, seeping through their clothes, stealing the strength from their limbs. They could not feel their hands or feet. They worked in a desperate, silent fury, the roar of the creek and the howl of the wind swallowing all sound. At one point, a heavy log surged toward Verity. Temperance screamed a warning that was lost in the storm, but she threw herself forward, shoving her sister out of the way, taking the glancing blow on her own shoulder. The pain was a white-hot flash, but she stayed on her feet. They were losing. The debris was coming too fast. The water was still rising. Just when it seemed they would be overwhelmed, a light appeared through the driving snow. It was Abram, a lantern held high in one hand, a heavy cant hook in the other. He had seen the rising creek and had known they would be in trouble. Without a word, he joined them in the water, his immense strength adding to their own. Together, the three of them fought the creek, a small, defiant island of humanity against the storm's rage. They worked through the night, a long, dark battle against the elements, until finally, just before dawn, the storm broke. The sky cleared to a pale, bruised purple. The creek, though still high and angry, began to recede. The flume had held. The headgate was intact. Their work had survived. They stumbled out of the water, soaked and shivering, their bodies numb with cold and exhaustion. Abram built a massive fire on the mill floor, and they huddled around it, steam rising from their clothes. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They had faced the worst the valley could throw at them, and they had endured. The next days were a blur of final preparations. They seated the newly repaired driveshaft, fitting the iron bands Abram had forged. They hoisted the new iron gear into place, its teeth meshing perfectly with the wooden cogs of the pit wheel. They greased every moving part with tallow. The entire mechanism, from the water wheel outside to the great millstones inside, was finally connected. It was the last week of December. The air was still and frigid. The ground was covered in a thick blanket of snow. It was time. Temperance, Verity, and Abram stood at the head gate of the flume. Verity and Abram took hold of the heavy levers that would lift the gate. Temperance stood by the great wheel, her hand resting on its cold, damp wood. She gave a single, sharp nod. With a groan of protesting wood and iron, the gate lifted. The water, clear and powerful, surged into the flume. It flowed down the channel, a straight, clean line of dark water against the white snow. It struck the paddles of the great wheel. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rushing water. Then, with a deep, shuddering groan, the wheel began to move. It turned slowly at first, fighting a generation of stillness. Then it gathered speed, its motion becoming smooth and powerful. Inside the mill, the world came alive. The great driveshaft began to turn. The massive wooden gears engaged with a sound like the grinding of mountains. The runner stone, which had been still for 30 years, began to spin upon its bedstone, faster and faster, until it became a blur, emitting a low, powerful hum that vibrated through the stone floor, through the soles of their feet, through their very bones. The mill was alive. The sound of it, the deep, rhythmic pulse of a working grist mill, rolled out of the ruin and down the valley. It was a sound no one in Providence had heard for a lifetime. It was the sound of a promise kept. The sound of the turning millstones carried on the cold, clear air all the way to Providence. People came out of their houses, out of the general store, their faces tilted upriver, listening. It was a sound from their grandparents' stories, a half-forgotten memory. At first, there was disbelief. Then, curiosity. A few of the town's men walked the 2 miles up the creek. They stood in silence, watching the great wheel turn, steady and strong, in the icy water. They peered inside and saw the 2 young women, no longer girls, standing beside the spinning stones, their faces calm and serious. There was no triumph in their expressions, only the quiet satisfaction of a difficult job done well. The men returned to town with the news. The Shaw sisters had done it. They had resurrected the ghost. Judge Cromwell heard the news in his office. He refused to believe it. He rode up to the mill himself, his face a mask of cold fury. He saw the turning wheel, the solid roof, the clean, orderly workshop inside. He saw the sisters, and the old blacksmith Abram standing with them like a guardian. The judge dismounted, his deed clutched in his hand. "This is a violation," he snarled, his voice tight with rage. "The structure is not up to code. It is a danger to the public. The foundation is true, the walls are sound, and the wheel is balanced," Temperance said, her voice even. "There is no danger here. The deadline was the 1st of the year," Cromwell spat. "It is not yet the 1st. You have failed. Today is the 29th of December, Verity stated simply. Cromwell waved the deed. "There are clauses, stipulations you cannot possibly understand. This property is forfeit." It was then that Abram stepped forward. He was holding a heavy, leather-bound ledger. It was the original county survey book from 40 years prior. He opened it to a specific page. "The original deed, Judge," Abram said, his voice a low rumble. "The one your father signed. It grants the owner of this mill inviolable and perpetual rights to the water of Swift Creek. It supersedes any subsequent deed, especially one drawn up in bad faith." He pointed a thick finger at the elegant, looping script. "It says the purpose of this land is to harness the power of the creek for the good of the valley. These young women have done that. You have tried to obstruct it." Cromwell's face went pale. He knew that book. He knew the old laws. He had been beaten, not by legal trickery, but by honest work and a long memory. The townspeople who had followed him up the trail murmured amongst themselves. They looked from the sputtering, furious judge to the 2 determined sisters and the steady, turning wheel. They had laughed at these orphans. They had watched them walk out of town with nothing and had expected them to fail. But the sisters had not failed. They had taken a ruin and made it whole. They had taken a joke and turned it into a future. Cromwell, defeated and humiliated, turned without another word and stormed away. No one watched him go. All eyes were on the mill. In the years that followed, the Blackwood mill did not just grind grain. The steady, reliable power of the turning wheel was a force that reshaped the Providence Valley. Temperance, with her innate understanding of mechanics, and Abram, with his mastery of iron, designed and built a system of belts and drive shafts that ran from the mill's main gear. They ran a line to Abram's smithy, powering a new bellows and a trip hammer, allowing him to work faster and take on bigger jobs. Then, they ran a line to a new sawmill, built just downstream, which turned the valley's timber into lumber for new houses and barns. The town of Providence had been powered by a single, unreliable steam engine that broke down constantly and cost a fortune in coal. One by one, the businesses turned to the sisters. The livery, the ice house, the new textile loom. They offered contracts, not for money, but for shares of the business. The sisters did not seek to rule the town that had scorned them. They sought to build it. Verity, with her quiet wisdom, drew up the agreements. They were fair. They were simple. They asked for a small percentage of the profits in exchange for the power they provided. They did not want to be masters, they wanted to be partners. The valley began to prosper. The power from the creek was constant and cheap. New families moved in, drawn by the promise of work. The town grew, but it grew differently. It was built on the foundation of the sisters' competence and integrity. They never married. They lived together at the mill, which they slowly transformed from a workshop into a home. They rebuilt the walls, stone by stone. They added rooms, a porch overlooking the creek, a garden where Verity grew vegetables and herbs. The mill was their sanctuary and their kingdom. They were not lonely. They had their work, their partnership, and the deep, abiding respect of the valley they had saved. Judge Cromwell faded into obscurity, a bitter old man whose legal papers had proven less powerful than a turning wheel. Sometimes, children from the town would walk up to the mill and watch Temperance at work, their eyes wide with wonder at the spinning gears and shafts. She would always stop what she was doing and explain the logic of the machine, showing them how each part worked in harmony with the others. She was passing on the knowledge her father had given her, the understanding that the world was a set of problems that could be solved with patience and a true level. The brass spirit level always sat on a shelf in the main room, its bubble perfectly still, a silent testament to the foundation upon which their lives had been built. The people who should have cared for them had cast them out, but the earth and the water had taken them in. They had arrived with nothing but $1 and a memory, and from that, they had powered a whole world. The water of Swift Creek still flows, and the stones of the old mill still stand. They outlasted the sisters, and the town they helped to build, and the memory of the laughter on the courthouse steps. The water is just water. It only does what it is told. And for a lifetime, it was told to turn a wheel, to grind the grain, and to light up a valley for two women who refused to be broken.